Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Jacqueline Simpson's From the Cradle to the Grave. This is a chapter from her Folklore of the Welsh Border. It's the second edition, if we really need to be precise. And this is sort of a this is kind of a classic way, because these are almost sort of a default chapter that one would have in a collection of regional folklore, that you often will come across these things that basically discuss the life cycle of rites of passage. And she has elsewhere in the book, she has two chapters that take you through the calendar year, and specifically about, I think one is from midsummer to midwinter, and one is midwinter to midsummer. And so, the various performances, the various beliefs about that time that give rise to certain sort of pivot points, and when the group comes together and celebrates itself. So From Cradle to the Grave it doesn't go through absolutely every rite of passage. It basically focuses on three. And you can argue the three major ones: birth, marriage, and death. There are, in a traditional community, you would probably include marriage in that as well. Perhaps in the 21st century, you would have that at the very least, on a second tier, because we don't all get married, but we all are born and we all die. Sorry to bum you out so early in the morning, which is when I presume you are watching this. So one of the things to think about when we think about this reading is that she's much more interested in the beliefs rather than particular prescribed rituals or events. That basically this is about passages, and re-emphasizing what Van Gennep talks about when he talks about sort of these pivot moments, that they are at times of danger. There needs to be, where danger is basically defined by uncertainty, and the danger that comes from a great change. There needs to be some kind of practice that shaves down that danger into something manageable. And the key points to bear in mind is magic. Magic, the way the folklorist understands it, is still rooted in James Fraser's discussion of sympathetic magic from the Golden Bough. And that Fraser might not have much going for him as a piece of scholarship, but folklorists still use his idea of magic because it expresses something so well and so simply, that fundamentally sympathetic magic can be defined almost as like acts upon like, and that objects are understood to have reaction to other objects or other subjects based on one of two criteria: either the fact that they have been in contact with each other, which is what we call contagious magic, or that they have some kind of resemblance to each other. They're similar in form, which is what we call homeopathic or sometimes imitative magic. And so if we have something, if we do something, if we perform something, and if we perform it with particular objects, we are able to control in some way this other thing and control fate. And the other term to consider is the notion of the superstition, which is folklorists are kind of on the cusp about whether that, because superstition is one of those words that has such a colloquial meaning as blah, that's just with that disparaging aspect. And folklorists don't like to be disparaging about belief practices, because it doesn't necessarily mean that a folklorist believes them to be true, but rather that they are not entered into because someone is inherently naive or silly, that there is a performative aspect of them that is important. But basically a superstition, as it were, because again the term sometimes gets used despite all the codicils and the warnings. The superstition is basically, it's an effort to control or exert a control over something that otherwise we would have no control over, through manipulation of some kind of forces. Um, and so, I mean, one of the good examples is, and a very popular practice in Canada, is the hockey beard, or the playoff beard, where during, hockey is a sport that Canadians occasionally play. And if during the playoffs, if the team is doing well, not simply will members of the team, but even their fans will refrain from shaving, as if to make any change to the habit, to appearance, and literally to cut something off is like almost cut off a streak. So it's this form of luck. It's this form of trying to change and have some kind of control over the uncontrollable. We see a superstition a lot in sports. We see superstition a lot in dangerous industries as well, like fishing, and we see belief practices among fisher folk, in large part because there is a realm of activity beyond their control that they can be incredibly skilled, and yet after a while it basically comes up to luck or to fate. With athletes, I mean, when you are on the realm of elite athletes are paired against other elite athletes. The distinction in skill is minute, at which point it's like, I need something else. And so we see that interesting transference. And so we have these sort of three large movements in Simpson's work. And again, it focuses much more on the actual practice, the actual beliefs behind, beliefs about these changes, beliefs about the passage and the risk that is associated with the passage, and therefore the things that one does to alleviate that potential risk. It's good to consider the concept of vernacular religion, that we have, if we live in a religious grouping as well, where some of our ways of being in the world are sustained not simply through the inertia and importance of tradition, but the sense that tradition was originally informed by a transcendent being, and this is not something that emerged through habit and through practice, but through dictate. That this is how we ought to be. We can think about religious practices that way. Vernacular religion is more or less how the group interprets that and celebrates it in a number of different manifestations. It's kind of this practice, these practices that kind of flow over top of whatever official religion is, if the religious tradition has a bureaucracy and a very fixed set of what constitutes official practice. Vernacular religion is that which is sort of superimposed on top, over and above local practice that might already be sort of within this realm of discretion, and that adapt accordingly to your own parish. It might be basically what you bring into the home. So how you might understand angels, how you might understand the use of candles. I'm using very sort of Catholic oriented ones. How you do your prayer, what constitutes the appropriate celebration of a feast day, and that it might be something that's marked on your calendar. We are temporarily not talking about a rite of passage, but I'll get back to that. Something that might be marked on your calendar. It is celebrated in a particular way. There might be a particular mass that is read that day. There might be particular expectations that are brought forward, and yet over and above that, you might have family traditions that are almost that the analyst might be able to disentangle from official practice, but are so much part of the way you understand personal holiness and personal sanctity that they're almost intertwined. And so, like how one decorates for Christmas, how one decorates for Ramadan, how one does the meal. These things. I mean, we know Ramadan, the meal at the end of Ramadan, the Eid meal at the end of Ramadan. There is a set expectation of what it is, but there's still, what's the word I'm looking for? There's still room to interpret that. And so, that's sort of the idea of vernacular religion, that for those who practice, there's always going to be a particular level of subjective interpretation that sometimes can actually be in conflict with what official dictates are. A lot of angelology, a lot of saint worship is kind of in contradiction. The notion of believing in ghosts is, you can make an argument that it's actually opposed to much official doctrine, but nevertheless it persists, and people hold those two to be quite commensurate with each other, despite the fact that officially they might not be. There are some problems with this reading, in that she will occasionally still be using words like primitive or holdover or remnant, and that's a little bit icky. This is a recent edition, early 2000s, late 90s, if I recall. I have it written down somewhere. But originally came out in 75, and she's using a lot of, even though she has a certain amount of interview sources and people who are practicing it in the early 20th century, she's using a lot of archival sources. And it's an older form of folklore, this remnant discussion. And we can just sort of let it sit. And again, with any kind of reading, we try and not throw babies out with bathwater, to use Proverbs. We try and grasp what is of benefit from it, and then but let's not forget that this is sort of bubbling under the surface. We need to we can't ignore that. So basically, as I said, these three moments: birth, marriage, and death. And one of the things about birth practices is the idea that fundamentally what you want is a healthy child. You might, on occasion, because we live in patriarchal societies, you might want a healthy male child. But for the most part, you want a healthy, unblemished, hale, hearty child. And unblemished, it might be actually sort of one of the best places to start. Because when we think about magic, and that one of the things that one doesn't do, one avoids doing things like eating strawberries if you're pregnant, because you might have a strawberry birthmark. If you think that's a thing that you don't want your child to have, then that is something that you're going to avoid. And of course, there's not, the layman in me will still suggest that there is no scientific basis for that. I'm not a scientist, I don't actually know, and yet for some reason I feel very confident in affirming that. But it does work on the level of magic, in that if you eat a thing that resembles a strawberry, like acts as like acts upon like, you are going to have some potential risk of inhabiting the properties of a strawberry. Similarly, the hare. If a hare crosses your path, bouncy rabbit, you might end up with a child with a hare lip, a cleft palate, which again is is something that you typically would wish to avoid a child having. So interestingly, in the Welsh borders, that's not the same for a rabbit. It is specifically a hare. So as she points out, there is some kind of specificity of it. There are also properties that are associated with the caul and the placenta, and that this notion of fecundity is going to have some kind of ongoing fecundity. So it might be used in some form of, the placenta might be buried alongside a tree, or buried isn't necessarily the right word in this form, even though it might be the same action. Planted under a tree to feed it. And again, in this case, there might actually be scientific validation for it. Again, I'm not a scientist, I'm a folklorist. But more importantly, there is a folkloric magical property about it, and that this is something that is generative. So planting this thing will help other things become generative. And then there's like the ritual cleansing that involves, again, related to birth and baptism and so on. But like cleaning is an important way of, because of the disjuncture of childbirth, because of the embodied uncertainty of childbirth, and we are dealing with cultures prior to 1950. This is not ancient history. With child mortality was high. Child mortality was high. Mothers dying at the moment of childbirth was still a regular occurrence. These are fraught moments, and because they are fraught moments, there are every effort to protect. So the idea of this transition, not simply the period leading up to birth, at which point the mother and perhaps even the entire community, to a certain extent, avoids certain practices in order to ensure the how the baby will arrive, or how the baby will be embodied upon their arrival. There are also ways of basically taking this terrifying seismic moment and reaffirming its place and bringing to an end. One of the things about ritual cleansing is that it is what one does at the end of something that is associated with disjuncture, with dirt, with forms of embodiment, obviously with blood. And so, we have the scientific rationale for cleansing. Even prior to germ theory, we can recognize that clean is preferable to encrustation. But we have the ritual aspect, in that it is a way of making things new. It is a way of bringing something to an end. Marriage, one of the things that we need to do. Marriage is the unity of two families. It is the blessing of the community on these two people, forming some kind of responsible bond that is going to be a contributing factor within the community, is going to be something that contributes to the next generation, and it needs to have some kind of blessings put upon it. And not blessings necessarily in terms of divine blessings, but really community sanction. So we have things like the reading of the banns already in Christian tradition, and of course this is Shropshire. This is the counties between, say, the West Midlands, the Black Country of England, and the Welsh border. So we're almost, and in the 19th and early 20th centuries, we're dealing more or less exclusively with a Christian population, certainly in the rural settings. But really the blessings of the community, the sanction of the community, because rites of passage are about groups. They are about the individuals moving through a group, but they are fundamentally about the continuation of the group and the recognition of the group and the sanction of by the group of the individual as they move through it, because it is a temporary, one person's temporary shift in status, that classic Van Genepian move of separation, transition, and incorporation, has fundamentally ripples throughout the entire group, or so it is understood, because one of its constituent members is changing. And so we reaffirm the continuity in part by recognizing, okay, you're changing, that's going to happen, and we're cool with it. Unfortunate, unsanctioned marriages, they're not unsanctioned, but marriages with a certain amount of disapproval on them have forms. There's the things in Canada, there's the end in here as well. But in Canada, we'll talk about the chivalry, a marriage that does not necessarily meet the approval of the group will sometimes be met with a hideous noise in the middle of the night. People will come and either on the wedding night or soon thereafter, will raise a ruckus, will come in disguise, shoot guns in the air, make cacophonous sounds, and demand entry, demand being fed. And the proper response is for this new couple to basically welcome this disruptive presence in, at which point, at the end of this night, the group has expressed its disapproval and therefore moves on. And so it required this additional step of sanctioning the group, the marriage. But there's just tons of different omens. And again, I'm not going to repeat the reading because there's all these like lovely examples, but they're about bearing in mind that they are about these Van Genepian pivots. They are about these moments of uncertainty. And especially when we're talking about, she doesn't talk about it a huge amount, but there's sort of the implication about, wishing for, and particularly the bride, wishing for a good husband, wishing for someone who is going to be a provider, wishing for someone who is going to be caring and loving, and that sounds all very nice and well and good, and lovey-dovey and princessy and fairy tales and kind of icky, but the flip side is really wishing for someone who is not going to be violent, wishing for someone who is not going to be oppressive, wishing for someone who is not going to be dangerous. And so there are, as much as these have the almost sweetly romantic ideas of the man that I marry aspect to them, bear in mind that there's a subtext of just what could be otherwise, especially in situations where there is the expectation of, and perhaps not necessarily even the choice of not being wed. So we have these different moments, we have these different ways of being in the world. And finally, death. I mean, we'll speak about death omens and the expectation of that a death will be coming soon, either to someone in the community, but often someone who is already there. It's like now we recognize that someone is dying, and how we read omens. And these are typically retroactive in that, this happened. I mean, a lot of the development of a belief practice, a superstition in a community, is a kind of post hoc ergo propter hoc. This thing happened after that thing, therefore this thing happened because of that thing. And so, I mean, you don't necessarily need to identify moment number one to go back to that strawberry example. It's like baby was born with a strawberry birthmark. Mother ate a strawberry, ergo they are in direct correlation, A, because they resemble, and B, because one happened in sequence to another. And therefore there's a causal relationship that's in place. And so death omens are similar to that. Harbingers of death. He died the night before there was a dog on the moor baying. Ergo, the dog on the moor baying was indicating that a death was coming. And then that becomes practice. And then, again, it is folly to try and look back and prove the definitive first account of these things happening. But it's not necessarily folly to do a reconstruction, and because that is it's a reconstruction, at least, of the logic that underpins a belief. So again, there's very much things of propitiating the dead or the dying, the paying of respects, the paying off of symbolic debts, the washing of the body, again, washing being an important moment, the memorializing in some ways through redolent flowers like rosemary's, through cairning with stones, and a way of, again, the group reaffirming that both the individual was an important member of the group, and that their passing, moving away, their separation from the group will be noted and felt and remembered, and simultaneously that the group will nevertheless continue without this person. So that kind of flow, that kind of shift. So this article isn't much about the staged performances that we might sometimes think of when we think about certain forms of customs, these scripts for celebrating a thing. Nevertheless, I think it gives this perfect illustration of the uncertainty, the fear, the potential risk, symbolic though it might be, the potential symbolic risk of what happens when someone moves through these seismic changes that are going to have ramifications not simply for the individual but for the group. The belief that underpins them, and therefore these behaviors that we do collectively to try and make that shift. So when you think about your own customs, you think, well, what are the origins of this? And not necessarily the origins in terms of the specific genetic lineage of why I do this particular thing, but rather what is the question that is being addressed? What is the uncertainty? What is the moment of ambiguity that this symbolic practice is tempering? Yeah, that's a good way of ending this. And what is this? This is Ian. This is Ian, who's been talking about Jacqueline Simpson's From the Cradle to the Grave. It's it's mainly descriptive reading. It's not very long. There's lots of stuff. If you like old-fashioned stuff, there's lots there, and you'll probably be reading it and go, "Ooh, look at that! That's fun." But just take the long view and think about how, when you're reading it, think about how this is a group contemplating the unknown, contemplating the present, the past, the future, and symbolically acting upon it in order to bend it to a desired outcome. Yeah, that's what I want to say. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. So, take care, and bye-bye.